I would like to start this video by stating that two thoughts can coexist at the same time. I can and do subscribe to the fact that Edwina Sharma was in fact right to be pissed at what was a betrayal from Kate. Because we can spin it however we want, but the truth is that Anthony Bridgerton was actively courting Edwina, whilst at the same time flirting and falling in love with her sister. And Kate, who was aware that Edwina was being courted by Anthony, still found herself falling for him anyway. I mean, sure, I can see why she would. Anthony Bridgerton is hot as hell, and he's smart and witty, and is as stubborn as she is, and utterly irresistible with the way he keeps claiming to be a gentleman whilst wanting to do very ungentlemanly things to her. I can see why she found herself falling for him, with the parts of him, the soft and sensitive and equally as wounded parts of him, that he very rarely shows anybody else but her. The heart wants what the heart wants, and Anthony shows that very well, even though they did hurt Edwina in the process. And so I can hold the thought that Edwina was right to be angry when everything came out. But I can also hold the thought that a lot of what went down with regards Anthony and Kate and the courtship of Edwina is also because Edwina Sharma was unaware of her own mind, preferred to be blissfully in the dark, willing to obediently follow her sister's leading and urging without actually taking the time to pause and ask herself if truly that was what she wanted, if that was the life that she desired, until things came to a head and blew up in everyone's face, and she, unwilling to even consider the small role she might have played in the matter, chose to lash out in a very human way at the betrayal that she felt. Keyword here being human, because once again, I can understand where her hurt is coming from and why she reacted the way she did. If Edwina was the lead character and the love interest in the show, and this exact circumstance and scenario had happened to her, a lot of the audience would most certainly extend her more grace than she has gotten from a large part of the fandom, particularly from Anthony fans. And I say this as a Anthony fan. Lead character halo is a real thing, especially with regards how fandom treats side characters, where in their pain and hurt and slight, they are easily swept away and considered invalid if the hurt was necessary in order to further the story and romance of our main leads. It is unfortunately the state of things, and it does make me extend a bit more grace to these side characters, Edwina inclusive. Which leads me back to my initial point. Both statements and thought, i.e. that Edwina is justified in her rage, but she also kind of had a role to play in the mess that she was unwilling to admit to herself, can be true. Because see, the reason why I do find the Sharma sisters fascinating, and the reason why season 2 of Bridgerton would always have a hold on me, is because it always brings me around to ask very important questions. In the case of Edwina, can naivety be a justification for being railroaded when everything is finally brought to light and revealed? And do note that when I bring up Edwina's naivety and how it plays into the season, I'm looking at it from different fronts. The first is her lack of knowledge with regards what she actually desires from a husband, the stakes that come with that desire, and the boundaries that she needs to absolutely maintain in order to secure what she wants. The second is her lack of understanding with regards Anthony Bridgerton and what makes him tick. Because yes, I really do believe that she never really got to know Anthony. Of course, part of it is not really her fault because Anthony does not take the time to let her see through to the real him, but that is also tied to the fact that with her, he was perfunctory in his dealings, and we'll get to that in a bit. And the third bit is more focused on her relationship with Kate. The absolute trust she has in her sister, which would ideally be okay except when one considers that humans are fallible, and also Edwina is quite picky with what she agrees blindly with Kate on and what she doesn't. And that just spells the disaster that was the event of her courtship by Anthony. All of which together, to me at least, contributes to how she ends up deceiving herself in that whole affair. Let's talk more about this in the rest of the video. And of course, we'll kick things off with the very first point. Edwina actually has no clear understanding of what she wants in a husband. And before you immediately give me a knee-jerk response of, well, she desired a love match, I would suggest that you watch the earlier episodes of season 2 again. Because that wasn't what she had in the cards for herself. The person who was convinced that a love match was the best course of action for her was Kate. Because Kate knew what she wanted in a marriage. Someone who would love her and only her and be devoted to her. And yes, she did project that desire onto Edwina, which was what she was judging Edwina's suitors by. Although, in Kate's defense, I would say that that albeit read to me as Kate knew of Edwina's love for romantic stories and just being swept in the grandeur of things. She's a reader, after all, and so came to the conclusion that based off of her sister's interest and to protect her sister's interest, because trust me, love does go a long way and can be the difference between a dutiful marriage that slowly squeezes the life out of a person and one filled with warmth and kindness and respect, which is obviously what Kate wanted for Edwina. The problem is that the show had us see quite clearly that Edwina herself wasn't quite sure of what she wanted. Because every time Kate pointed out to her that Anthony, who Edwina had set her eyes on, which once again, I'm not going to blame her for, Anthony Bridgerton had quite the glow up in season 2 and seemed to focus all that attention on her. Of course, it went to her head a bit. But as I was saying, every time Kate pointed out to Edwina that Anthony was looking for a dutiful match, that he wasn't marrying for love and wasn't interested in that, Edwina brushed it off, basically implying that she was okay with that. She wants a titled match after all. The impression we were made to have was that Edwina was okay with what she could get with Anthony. She knew there wasn't going to be that spark in their marriage, but she was quite okay with him as a match. Or at least she was. Until she spotted him and Kate making goo-goo eyes at each other while she was at the altar about to marry the man. Which I have to say was rank as hell. I was entertained, of course, but at the same time I kept screaming, what are you two doing at them high fucking each other in front of God, Edwina, and the rest of the entire town? That season tried my patience, not gonna lie. But as I was saying, she was okay with that until she spotted him and Kate eye fucking each other, and I do think that that was when it clicked for her. Because up until that point, I really do think that Edwina had naively not considered what marriage would be like with a husband who doesn't love you. I don't think she ever really truly considered that, hey, if he doesn't love me, that doesn't mean that he might not come around to loving someone else. It wasn't until she was at the altar that that truth hit her, which was why she followed it up by throwing a "do you love me" line at Anthony. A question Anthony couldn't rightfully answer because he had always been upfront and clear on what he could and couldn't give in his marriage to her, and love was most certainly not on the cards. And that is what makes Edwina flip out in that scene. The realization that the love that she had in her ignorance, not really considered or wanted in her marriage at the start, was something that had clearly been handed over to her sister. Now, I'm sure there are some of you watching right now thinking, well, Noria, was Edwina upset about the Anthony cannot love her bit, or was she more upset about the Anthony cannot love her, but he most certainly seems to have fallen in love with her sister bit? And to that, I would say it's a little bit of both, which speaks to how naive she is about the character of Anthony Bridgerton, the man she had hoped to marry. Now, please note, like I stated earlier, Edwina at the start didn't know the specifics of what she wanted with her marriage. She was okay with marrying Anthony because he is handsome and a Viscount. And I bring up the fact that he's a Viscount because she does express a delight at being a Viscountess. She wanted a title match after all, and no, I don't judge her for that at all. There is a ton of security with having the title and being married to a Viscount as young and hot as Anthony, who has an amazing family to boot. But as I was saying, she was okay with marrying Anthony, but in her ignorance never really considered what life would be like married to him. Which is why at first she was okay with accepting him in any way in which she could get him, i.e., she wasn't particular about the love because it didn't matter to her at that time. But upon realizing that Anthony Bridgerton was quite capable of love, except that the love wasn't directed at her but at her sister, she realized then that love did factor a significant bit for her after all, and asked him if he loved her. Which is important to note because at this point, Anthony, the dumbass, was still quite ready to marry her after she ran away. It was the entire spectacle with him that had her finally realize that love did matter to her after all, which is what factored in the person she ended up married to in season 3 back in India. Which is a good place for me to point out to those who were dropping in the comments in my Lord Devlin video that Edwina married Prince Frederick. She did not. She married someone else and is living in India as at season 3. And Kate does imply that it's a match that Edwina is happy about, which we can infer means that it was a love match. But please remember, as at when everything blew up skywide in the season, Edwina didn't actually know what she wanted, and that contributed actively to how far things went because Anthony Bridgerton, in courting Edwina, was quite clear to himself, to Kate, and by extension Edwina, and to us the audience, that he wasn't looking for love and didn't want that match with her. Edwina accepting his proposal was her tacitly agreeing to those terms, only for her to realize that she didn't want it anymore, rejects it, which is fair, but then blows up in a way that had me thinking, girl, what did you think was going to happen? Because in my book, even if it wasn't Kate, Anthony Bridgerton would have found himself falling for someone else. We already know that he's quite capable of getting into his feelings and everything just gets messy at the end when that happens, a la Sienna back in season 1. So for me, what she had tacitly agreed to was that he was never going to love her, but she hadn't actually considered that him not loving her does not equate to him not loving anyone else. It wasn't until they got to the altar that she finally came around to that and realized it and decided to walk. And of course, things played out all right in the end, with Anthony finally getting his head out of his ass and realizing that he really desperately wants to marry Kate instead, to everybody's relief. And speaking of Anthony, that's the next bit where Edwina's ignorance showed itself because she legit had zero idea who he actually was. Like I stated earlier, this isn't all her fault because it was clear in his interactions with her that Anthony's persona was way more calmer, more put together, more befitting a Viscount. But the problem was that Edwina did not look beyond that. She didn't look at how he interacted with others, the bits where his mask slips away and revealed who Anthony actually is. And I don't think anything made this as clear for me as her conversation with Daphne when she calls Anthony even-tempered. And Daphne looks at her with the, girl, Anthony? Anthony Bridgerton? Even-tempered? Are you sure you're talking about my brother? Because what? And I do think that's another aspect of the reason why Daphne thought that Anthony could do better with Kate, that we don't really talk about much. Because Daphne could see that in addition to how Anthony's eyes always seem drawn to and follow Kate about, he's also more himself with Kate than he is with Edwina, who she realizes doesn't really know her brother so well. That was what sealed it for me. Because sure, when talking with Edwina, Anthony does have his act together, but what I found interesting was that even in situations and circumstances where she's with him and is in the company of others, which is when Anthony's competitive, hot-tempered, argumentative, occasionally combative self shines through, she doesn't actually notice. The entire sequence with them playing Pall Mall at the Bridgerton's estate showed Anthony as he actually is. When he lets go of all the airs and his truly competitive self shines through. I found it interesting that in that scene, Edwina looked almost lost. Like her energy just didn't mesh well, like he had the capacity and was absolutely going to overwhelm her. And that was his true self. The expectation would have been seeing how he is around his family, because we do tend to be our most truest self amongst family. I thought that would have created quite the point of consideration and introspection on Edwina's part to realize that the Anthony Bridgerton she has built in her head might not be the person as he really is. But Edwina doesn't do that. Which I think is a big shame, because part of her not really considering what her marriage to him would entail and what he's capable of boils down to the fact that she doesn't really know Anthony Bridgerton. What she knows is the idea of him that is befitting his station and that he is quite the catch. But anything else, we don't really get to see her consider or even think about. Which is why I think the whole sequence at the altar hurt her so much. Because that was what finally removed the blindfold and she started to actually think and come to several realizations about him, her relationship with him, his relationship with Kate, and the disaster of a marriage she had almost tied herself into. And speaking of Kate, there's the fact that Edwina followed Kate's suggestions to a T. From the people she met to those she greeted and interacted with to the suitors that were allowed to come calling and who she responded to. Now, the show made it pretty clear to us that from the start, Kate had served as Edwina's de facto mother whilst Mary was out of commission after their father's death. She's learned all her life to trust her big sister, and I do not begrudge her that. The problem, however, was the fact that, like I said, because Kate had always served this larger-than-life persona in her life, she considered Kate infallible in certain aspects, which I'm sure contributed a lot to how betrayed she felt when she learned that Kate was just as much in love with Anthony as he seemed to be with her. But what I also found interesting was that she seemed to listen to Kate to an almost all-encompassing degree about everything Kate mentioned and wanted for her, except when it came to Anthony Bridgerton. When Kate was trying to dissuade her from considering Anthony a suitor by pointing out that Anthony didn't want a love match and would be a bad pick for her, that was the point where she started actively not listening to her sister. It read quite willful to me, and I don't know if anyone else saw it that way. Like, Edwina all her life had listened to and always followed what Kate suggested, and this was the first time that she decided that she wanted to step away and make her own choice. Which to me seemed to be what threw Kate off when she had to deal with the fact that for the first time for her as well, Edwina wasn't taking on her advice. What I found sad was that the one time when Edwina did make this choice for herself, that she was going to follow her own path and choose her own match, it was when she was blinded by her own naivety, when her brain hadn't processed what she actually wanted and whether or not Anthony Bridgerton could give her what she desired, or if Anthony Bridgerton was even the man she thought he was. The answer to that, as we know, is yes and no. But Edwina didn't know that, and like a child who is finding its feet, like a teenager who has to rebel in order to find their own way, that was how I read the way a lot of that went down with Edwina and Kate. Hell, there's something childlike about her thought process, that tossing Kate and Anthony together and forcing them into close proximity with each other would lead to her favorite people learning to get along. They did, of course. I mean, we all saw how that turned out. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the matter. Do you agree or disagree with me that Edwina was pretty naive and that naivety did have her deceiving herself with regards how things played out between her and Anthony and Kate? Please let me know in the comments. Like this video if you've watched this far and haven't done so yet. Share this if you want. Support me on Patreon if you can. And until tomorrow's video, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.